Hello, and welcome back to the Record of Arms. I'm your host, Mark 7, and today we'll continue our series on the Brewster Buffalo fighter with the second part of a story of its combat record flying for the Finnish Air Force. As always, the sources for this video can be found in the description. Thanks to all the people who watch and provide helpful feedback. It really motivates me to hear what y'all think of what I'm doing here, and helps me create a better video. As a man in my mid-40s, I'm an ancient relic as far as YouTubers go, and I'm figuring this out as I go. So with no further ado, let's continue the story. On the 2nd of September, the Finns, advancing on the isthmus, had reached the outer defenses of Leningrad. Here the drive was halted, and preparations made for the next move to the north. This offensive was planned to take the Karelian army from Tuolos to the river Svir, which joins the lakes of Ladoga and Onega, the southeastern end of the Karelian isthmus. To support this drive in the air, the Finns created the so-called Lukanen detachment, named for the leader of the first flight of Squadron LLV-24, Aino Lukanen. This detachment included 12 Brewsters from this squadron. These proceeded to Lunkola Island, off the northeastern coast of Lake Ladoga, where they would be based on an airstrip near the beach. The ground assault began the next day on the 3rd, when the advance of the Finnish 6th Corps began. The offensive pushed forward rapidly, and in 3 days the troops were 75 kilometers, or about 45 miles beyond their start line. They reached the river at Latanen-Pello by dawn on the 7th, occupying the northern shore of Lake Ladoga and completing the reconquest of the Karelian Isthmus. The next day the German forces on the Finns' right occupied the southern shore of the lake, and the long siege of Leningrad began. On the 12th, the Finnish High Command sent Squadron LLV-24 to Olonets, in the center of the isthmus, to support the advance of their 7th Corps, which was moving on Petrozavodsk. The first flight arrived at their new field at Numriola, and at once began flying support missions for the 6th Corps, which was engaged in crossing the Svir. The remaining 3 flights had arrived at their new stations in the Olonets area by the 16th, with the 2nd and 3rd flights being based on Mansi Island, off the coast of Lake Ladoga, and the 4th flight flying from Lukola Island. The offensive of the 7th Corps towards Petrozavodsk began the next morning. The 4th flight, led by Captain Perasovilius, went up against a force of 14 Soviet fighters near the objective town that day, and claimed 8 of them shot down. In reality, they had clashed with Lag 3s of the 238th Fighter Regiment. The Lags were some of the most modern monoplane fighters the Soviets had at the time. Early models were powered by 1100 horsepower liquid-cooled Klimov V12 engines and armed with 3 12.7mm Bezerin UBS machine guns and 2 7.62mm SHKS machine guns. In outline and profile, it vaguely resembled the American P-40 Warhawk or the British Hawker Hurricane. They were built to a Soviet requirement for a fighter using non-strategic materials, which in this case meant the airframe was made mostly of wood. As a result, it was heavier than most planes of its size, and consequently clumsier and less agile. This drawback, along with its wooden frame, earned it the nickname, quote, guaranteed varnished coffin. One of the Finnish pilots engaging the Lags, Lieutenant Ilkka Torenen, deputy flight leader, describes his part in the battle thus, misidentifying the Russian fighters as MiG-3s, quote, while flying as the leader of the swarm providing top cover for our troops, I attacked 5 MiG fighters. I fired at one obliquely from behind, the aircraft suffering numerous hits in the fuselage before it fell away into a spin. After this, I fired at another obliquely from ahead. This time I hit the fighter's engine, and it began to smoke heavily until it crashed. After pulling up, I observed 4 more MiG fighters. By now my swarm was together once again, and we immediately attacked the Russian aircraft. I fired at one obliquely from behind, saw numerous hits, and watched the fighter go down in a spin. I then attempted to attack a 4th MiG, but its pilot went into a dive and I could not catch it. Running low on fuel and ammunition, I broke off the chase and returned to base. On the 19th, a 6-plane patrol from the 3rd flight encountered 3 SB-2 bombers escorted by more Lag 3s, which the Finns again misidentified as Polikarpov I-18s. The I-18 was a Soviet design for a high-speed interceptor, which closely resembled the Lag in profile. None of these were actually produced, however, but the design must have been known to the Finns, as Lags in this theater were sometimes misidentified as I-18s in pilots' action reports. Sergeant Lauri Nissanen, piloting one of the 6 239s, shot down one of the SBs, all 3 of which were destroyed by the Finns. They then tangled with the escorts. He describes his part in this action thus, quote, "I spotted a single fighter coming directly towards me from below. I could not determine its nationality, so I dived away and then pulled alongside the machine in order to identify it. I quickly realized that the aircraft was an I-18, so I throttled back and pulled in behind it. Opening fire from close range, the fighter was soon trailing both smoke and fuel from its port wing. My guns then jammed. I managed to stay behind my foe while hastily cocking the guns in an effort to free the jams. I eventually got 2 of my weapons to function and shot at the I-18 again from close range. The aircraft subsequently crashed into the forest. The aircraft were flying at a height of 50 to 100 meters when I attacked them in BW384, which was his Brewster serial number, which returned to base with 6 bullet holes in it. This action provides an illustration of a frequently encountered problem that would plague pilots of the Brewster fighter in whatever nation's service. The machine guns were very prone to jamming. Handles to manually cock the weapons were located in the cockpit, which could sometimes be used to clear the jam. But these are very difficult to operate and required a good deal of strength on the part of the pilot. Even so, they were only successful occasionally in getting the weapons clear to fire again. In the case of the wing guns, the jams could almost never be cleared, and a jammed wing gun would render the aircraft at a great disadvantage, as firing the remaining wing gun would throw off the pilot's aim due to the uneven recoil effect. The problems with the Brewster's armament in this regard were less frequently encountered by Finnish pilots than by those of the Dutch and British Commonwealth squadrons. These latter, flying in the more humid and rainy regions of Singapore and the Dutch East Indies, where corrosion affected the firing solenoids much more often, would find the problem so crippling that some units would remove the 50 calibers and replace them with 303 caliber Brownings, which are much less prone to this problem. The low altitude at which this combat took place was typical of the aerial fighting here as elsewhere on the Eastern Front. This was another contrast to the fighting which the Brewster was involved in the Pacific, where much of the important combat took place above 20,000 feet, or 6,100 meters, where the aircraft's performance was significantly impaired. These 2 factors go a long way to account for the Finnish Brewster's superior combat performance compared with its counterparts in the other services, though of course the skill and determination of the Finnish pilots was not a negligible influence. Problems with the guns hampered the efforts of Captain Jorma Karhunen's 3rd flight again on the 23rd. He led 7 other 239 fighters on a patrol over Finnish infantry positions near Derevjanoja this day, and at 13:30 hours spotted a trio of I-16 fighters at treetop level, carrying out strafing attacks against the ground forces. His flight immediately went into the attack and shot down all 3 of the surprised Russians. His unit continued its patrol, and on the way back encountered another unit of 6 I-16s strafing near the site of the previous combat. Lieutenant Pekka Koko, who would shoot down 10 Russian planes in the 239, recalls this part of the battle, quote, "By gaining altitude, I got onto the tail of one of the Soviet machines, but when I attempted to open fire, my guns jammed. Breaking away from the enemy aircraft, I eventually managed to get my guns operable again. By now 2 of the I-16s were already being engaged by other Brewster pilots, but I spotted a 3rd attempting to flee at low altitude towards Petrozavodsk. Closing to within 50 meters of the enemy fighter, I fired several bursts at it as the I-16 skimmed over treetops at a height of just 10 meters. Despite seeing numerous hits on the fuselage and wings, the fighter refused to burn. However, its engine eventually seized and the I-16 rolled over and crashed into the forest close to Petrozavodsk. Despite the difficulties with the weapons, all but one of the second group of Russian fighters fell to the Finns. On the 26th, Karhunen's flight was once again chastising the Russians in this area. 7 Brewsters from this unit encountered Chaika fighters near the town of Petaja and claimed 6 of them. They continued their patrol and returned to the site of this combat on the way back. Here they discovered another formation of 8 I-15s from the 65th Attack Air Regiment, shot down 3 of them. Karhunen scored his 4th and 5th victories in the initial combat with the Chaikas, but was prevented from shooting down any members of the second group by the Russians' skillful use of cloud cover, which allowed them to evade his attacks as they fled in the direction of the river Svir. The next day, the first flight under Lukanen was in action again against a formation of I-15s and I-16s. 8 Brewsters met 8 Russian planes not long after 1600 hours, as recounted from Lukenen's combat report. Quote, 4 I-15s and 4 monoplane fighters were intercepted just beneath the clouds at Derevyannoye. The enemy pilots tried to seek refuge in the clouds, but not all of them made it. The aircraft shot up by Sergeant Ginman exploded in midair, and 2 other fighters crashed into the ground. All 3 of their victims in this action were I-15s. On the 1st of October, the Finns took Petrozavodsk, the capital of Karelia. Their army continued its advance, now along the western shore of Lake Onega. The fighters of LLV-24 continued to follow up and support the advance. They scored another notable success 6 days after the fall of the town. 8 239s of the 4th Flight under Persilvilius found a group of 15 Soviet fighters taking off from the airfield at Suopoja and hit them as they tried to get into the air. 5 of the Russians were destroyed, with Savilius claiming 1 shot down and another damaged. Quote, I-153s and I-16s were taking off from the airfield as we approached. I attacked an I-153, and when it tried to maneuver out of my line of fire, I slowed down behind it and hit the fighter repeatedly. It rolled over and crashed into the forest. I pulled up and went after an I-16 that I spotted flying at an altitude of 200 meters. I fired, and the fighter flew through the burst, but I had to pull up to avoid colliding with it, could not see my foe crash. I fired at a second I-16, but heavy flak over Suopoja forced me to break off the attack. On the 15th, a flight of 6 Brewsters under Lukenen ran into a group of 3 SB bombers of the 72nd High-Speed Bomber Regiment south of Lake Onega. These bombers were ski-equipped, which led to difficulties in recognition. The reason for the skis was unknown, as there was no snow in this area at the time. The why of this hardly mattered to the Finns, who closed in and shot down all 3 in quick succession. Lukenen scored his 5th victory in this action, as did one of his pilots, Warrant Officer Victor Piotzia, who described the battle thus, quote, at 15:05 hours we intercepted 3 bombers over Osta. Although they turned for home as soon as they saw us, I got on the tail of the trailing bomber as it banked away to the south. I fired several bursts at the aircraft and both of its engines caught fire. The bomber went into a dive and hit the ground. Nobody bailed out. The type was unknown, on skis and with its undercarriage down. It had the speed of a DB and a fuselage like a Ju-52 when viewed from the front. Gunners returned my fire at first, and they also threw out leaflets and all sorts of other stuff. Perhaps the ski-equipped bombers had simply arrived early, as winter soon started to make itself felt in the Karelian theater. With the winter came some new aircraft, as illustrated on the 7th of November, when 7 Brewsters under Lukenen were out on patrol west of the sphere. Here they encountered 3 Lag-3s escorting a modern twin-engine PE-2 bomber. The Finns went into the attack and shot down all 3 Lags, which were once again misidentified as I-18s, but the bomber was able to use its high speed to make a successful escape. This clash would be the last significant air action for LLV-24 during the period of the Finnish offensive. By the 6th of December, the army of Karelia had taken the Maselka Isthmus between Lakes Onega and Siestjärvi and pushed on as far as Povets. This completed the retaking of the territory lost to the Soviets in the previous year. The Finnish commander, Marshal Mannerheim, ended the advance at this time. Finnish forces on all fronts went over to the defensive and will remain on this line for the next 2.5 years. And so that is where I will end this video. In the next part of the Brewster series, we'll continue with our account of its war in the Finnish service, as the Finns went over onto the defensive along the old border. Here, a long stalemate would take hold, with little movement on the ground but with continued clashes between Finns and Russians in the air. I'd like to apologize for any Finnish listeners once again for my horrible pronunciation of the place names and personal names. And thanks again for your listenership and support. It greatly aids my motivation and helps the channel to grow. Until next time then, I remain Mark 7, wishing you all the best.